My fingers drummed impatiently on the table. I stole a glance at my watch and noticed time was swiftly advancing. If it were up to me, we would have left long ago. Of course, if it were up to me, I wouldn't be in this situation. I looked at my empty glass. His, on the other hand, to put it mildly, he had been sipping his beer for half an hour. My fingers continued their impatient tapping when suddenly I felt her hand on mine. Her delicate fingers grasped mine firmly. The cool touch of her skin softened me. I turned to look at Michaela, who seemed to say, "I know we only have a few minutes left." What she actually said, directed at the man across from us, was, "We're delighted everything has ended so well, Mr. Hume," Michaela said. "Matt, if you don't mind, that's thanks to you," he replied. "Actually, it's thanks to both of us," she said, turning to me. "Nate worked diligently on this." He said, glancing at me casually, though the client seemed ready to accept. Michaela was a beautiful girl, but for this particular meeting, she had chosen to wear an attractive yet discreet red dress. It was modest in some aspects, reaching just below the knees and having only a hint of cleavage, but it still drew many glances. Michaela always made an effort to dress well for her clients. We were on this trip together to finalize a contract. The contract had been signed, sealed, and delivered, but as is customary in this industry, the conversation didn't stop there. It wasn't always like this, but some clients were more interested in Michaela's bare spirit. "You're lucky, Nate," he said to me. "What do you mean, Matt?" "Working beautifully, beautiful," he replied. "Life could be worse." Michaela and I exchanged glances before laughing. "We're not a couple, I'm married," Michaela said, flashing her wedding ring. "And not with me," I quickly added. "Oh, I apologize. I just guessed from observing you two last week. You seemed inseparable and shared viewpoints, shared meals. I even saw you adjusting his collar yesterday, Michaela. I just want my colleague to take better care of our most important client." Michaela laughed. "If I were your husband, I'd be jealous," he said, pointing at me before adding, "or vice versa." He let out a laugh tinged with sadness, while Michaela and I pretended to smile. This final jest struck me deeply. Looking at Michaela sitting next to me, finishing the rest of her wine, looking as fragile as ever, and smelling as sweet as ever, it was hard not to love her. After working with her for several years, I had to admit there was something alluring about spending an entire week together, having breakfast, lunch, and dinner together, spending countless hours together, and not just once, staying up late together and having a few drinks. The illusion only faded when we returned to our separate hotel rooms. "I've been married for a year now," I heard Michaela's voice as I finally woke up from my dream. "And what about you, Nate? Are you married?" Matt asked me. "No, but if you propose with a walking stick, Matt, I'll consider it," I joked. Matt laughed again. I felt Michaela's hand touch mine, but this time, she turned my wrist to see my watch. Her eyes widened for a moment before she turned back to her client, as she called him. "Well, Matt, that's great, but if Michaela and I want to catch the plane, we should hurry," I said. "Nonsense. You only have one more bottle of wine," Matt said, clapping his hands on the table. "That's generous, Matt, but the office will go mad if we make them pay extra," I said. "I'm the client, and the client is always right. Give me a bill. Tomorrow, when you board the plane, give me a bill and I'll cover the cost." "I'll talk to your boss right now," Matt said, pulling out his phone. Michaela looked at me pleadingly. She didn't want to stay here longer than I did. I knew I had a choice, but I didn't know if I wanted to accept it. But as I looked at her, and she looked back at me with her eyes, I couldn't resist. "Well, Matt, I'd be happy to stay here and drink with you under the table, but I'm afraid it's just the two of us. Michaela can't join us," I said. If Michaela felt ashamed, she hid it very well. As for Matt, he could only mask his disappointment with clumsiness. "She's rushing to her father's 60th birthday party," I explained, Michaela's father turned 63 months ago, and she turned to look at me, staring intently. I brushed past it and continued to look at Matt. "Oh, my dear girl, I can't stand between my daughter and her old man's birthday bash," he said. I turned to Michaela and said, "See you back at work on Monday." Michaela smiled broadly and gently placed her hand on my arm before picking up her purse and standing up. I turned to Matt and prepared myself for what could be a long night, unless my gamble paid off. I stared intently at Matt and could almost see the gears turning in his head. Suddenly, he shook his head and said, "Oh, you should go with her, Nate. You're a good man, offering to stay with me, but you have a more important role, being a guide to a young lady." I swallowed hard at the lightness in my heart, but outwardly I said, "Are you sure? After all, today is Friday. I'm always up for a drink." "Ha, I like you, Nate, but next time don't wait for me to finish my drink. You should be more prompt." We quickly bid farewell and rushed out the door. I didn't notice this, but Michaela kept looking at me the whole time. I didn't notice until we were outside and stopped to call a taxi. "You're a really good friend, Nate." "What do you mean?" I said, encouraging her to continue. "Are you really intending to let me go and stay with him? I know you want to go home." "Well, but that's very kind of you. Thank you," she said, looking straight into my eyes. Just looking at her made my knees almost tremble. "It's nothing," I replied calmly. "Are we really late? If we hurry, we'll make it. Let's go back to the hotel, grab our luggage, settle the bill, and then head to the airport." "Right, sounds good. Do you think we can make it?" "Yes, don't worry, we can handle it." "Nothing's impossible for us," Michaela complained. "From here, I can see the plane, but they won't let us board. The gate's closed. We missed the flight." "No. What now?" "The girl at the check-in counter for the next flight will have." "Are you kidding? Do you have a better suggestion?" "No, I'm just sad. The plane is here." "Oh, there it is," I said as we watched the plane leave the terminal. Disappointed, Michaela sank heavily into a seat in the waiting area. I looked at the clock. It was late. I looked outside, only to see darkness. The sun had long set. It seemed almost impossible for us to catch another flight today, as is often the case in such situations. I started pacing uncertainly. "What are you doing?" "Sit down, Michaela," I said. "I don't want to. Why?" "Because I've spent enough time with you this week to know that when you're like this, I need to give you some space. No matter what." Michaela laughed and said, "Sit down," in a calmer tone. I smiled, took the books off my shoulder, and sat down next to her. Michaela said, "I should have listened to you. We shouldn't have had lunch with Matt." "No, you were right. After all, he's a client." "No, he just wanted the two of us to have a quiet drink together, which would have been much better than having lunch with him. I think he was quite rude to you." "Of course, I replied. I chuckled to myself. What did he mean? "Does this mean you drink in this dress?" He has an opinion. "What's wrong with your dress?" she said, smoothing out the wrinkles on the faded red fabric. "You look adorable," I said, choosing each word carefully. "And do you need to say that to him? He's an old man, and you're a young, beautiful girl. Oh, he's married. That won't stop him." "I'm married," she said angrily. "And I guess that's one of the many reasons why you don't want to sleep with him." "One of many," Michaela laughed, agreeing, then said, "Your husband can rest assured. Trust me, he's not calm." I frowned in confusion. Michaela noticed the silence and turned back to look at my face. She took a deep breath before laughing to herself and saying, "I've talked about him many times, not just this week, but in previous times." "Overall, or just this week?" "Both. You mean we often talk a lot at the company, so naturally you'll be mentioned in conversations. But this week, because of this trip, you've become closer." I think he's starting to feel a little jealous. "Why? We're not sharing a hotel room or anything." "No, But yesterday I told him on the phone that we had dinner together every night and that we understood each other very well. He responded by asking if I had a girlfriend. Oh, he'll never see me upset because of your husband. Michaela laughed before pausing to think about my response. What are you talking about? Before I could answer, we were interrupted by airport staff. Sir, I'm sorry, but there are no more flights on this route today. Damn, Michaela muttered beside me. When's the next flight? I asked, standing up. Tomorrow afternoon. Would you like to book 2 seats? I turned to Michaela, sitting with her arms crossed, silent in anger. The short-lived happiness I had restored faded away, and she returned to the gloomy mood that I detested. Michaela, I asked carefully. She frowned slightly, and I turned back to the staff, who immediately left to arrange everything. I sat down next to Michaela again, but remained silent. I certainly didn't take her anger personally. The fun and games were over. The week had been long and challenging, and while I might have felt happy to spend more time with the woman I had deeply loved for many years, I doubted Michaela was impressed. For her, it was just a long, tiring week, made slightly more bearable by the presence of a good colleague. Can we go back to the hotel? I finally asked. We can't do that, she snapped, sounding more disappointed than anything else. What do you want to do? Stay at the airport until tonight. We've already checked out. They'll give us the rooms back. We only left a few hours ago. Michaela exclaimed sharply and began to wrap her arms around herself with both arms. If my emotions toward her were mentioned, I would have to lie if I said the intention to spend more time with her didn't excite me. Although for obvious reasons, I had concealed my enthusiasm. Fine, we'll go back, Michaela sighed. Are you kidding? Michaela spoke up after leaving the airport, her mood dismal. She refused to look at the receptionist or me, which was probably best, as a smile appeared on my face. We just checked out. Of course, the rooms must be full already. These rooms were booked weeks ago. The receptionist explained. Your room is still available, but hers isn't. I turned to Michaela and asked slowly, so I won't be sharing a room with you. Just go to another hotel, she interrupted. You want to go from this hotel to another. What are you planning, Michaela? It's almost midnight. I want to go upstairs and sleep. Michaela looked at me with a disdainful look, making me add, I'll sleep on the floor, and you can take the bed. That's very kind of you, she said with a weak smile, slightly gentler, but I just thought it wasn't a good sign. Listen, we'll go with your idea. If you want to find another hotel with 2 empty rooms, we'll do that, or else give me a pillow, and I'll make myself comfortable on the floor. She looked at me for what seemed like an eternity before finally nodding silently. I felt a sense of satisfaction in my mind before turning back to the receptionist. By the time I got the access card, Michaela had already walked towards the elevator. We stood in silence in the elevator, walked down the corridor, and entered the quiet room. It was almost midnight, and we were both exhausted. I at least found some joy in the current situation, but clearly this feeling wasn't shared. Michaela didn't say a word, even as she opened up the duvet on the bed, unpacked her suitcase, and took out her pajamas. I timidly approached the bed, quietly grabbed one of the 4 pillows, and looked down at the floor. Perhaps Michaela finally admitted that this wasn't an ideal solution for both of us. She said softly, Do you need a blanket? Or maybe we should ask for another blanket. No, it's fine. It's really warm today, I replied. I'll be okay. Oh, all right. I'll go take a shower then. Do you need to use the bathroom first? No, you go ahead. I'll wait. I'll just collapse. She nodded, folded her clothes in a towel, then stepped into the bathroom. I whispered, I'll sleep on the floor in my hotel room. Michaela could only weakly smile in response before adding, Thank you, Nate. You're a good friend. After saying this, she disappeared into the bathroom. Perhaps that was for the best, because if she stayed to see my response, she wouldn't see my smile turn into a bitter expression. Someone might say I could be very happy, but the bitterness only increased by the fact that the girl I liked couldn't be reached. The fact that I heard the shower turn on and began to imagine Michaela undressing and stepping into the hot water flowing down her smooth white skin. The fact that there was nothing but a thin sliding door separating me from a naked and obviously very attractive Michaela. Unfortunately, I stood foolishly in the room, feeling the start of a very strong erection. Unsure of what to do in such a situation, taking a cold shower was out of the question because Michaela was in the bathroom. Perhaps this entire missed opportunity, from the flight to the hotel room, would cause more trouble than it seemed. This feeling only intensified as I threw the pillow onto the floor at the foot of the bed and tried to find a way to get comfortable on the hard, cold surface. I lay on the hard surface for a while, listening to the sound of the shower, until eventually my mind went blank and I just waited for her to come out. I knew she would be fully dressed, but I still waited with a hot breath to see what she would wear to bed. After what seemed like 10 or 20 long minutes, I received my answer. She remained silent for a few minutes. Sometimes, the water turned on, and I heard her brushing her teeth or making some other sounds, but otherwise, I just lay there and waited in silence. When she finally stepped out, she was wearing a small pair of shorts and a thin t-shirt. They were quite old and faded over time. She looked very casual, like at home, and for some reason, she made me more excited than if she had come out wearing lingerie. As she stepped out of the bathroom, she looked down at me and smiled before climbing onto the bed and asking, "Can I turn off the light?" With those words, she turned off the night light, and we were left alone in the dark room. "Good night," she said surprisingly cheerfully. "Good night," I replied. For a moment, I listened to the silence as she fumbled on the bed, trying to get comfortable. After a few minutes, the silence became deafening, not just because it was night and we were about to sleep, but also because it felt like we were both holding our breaths and very aware of each other. After a while, I asked, "Hey, Michaela." "Yeah," she replied. "Do you remember when we booked the hotel room together?" She groaned loudly. "I knew you'd make it complicated." "Oh, come on, this is fun. Relax, I'm not writing directly. This can be our little secret. It's better that way." "Good night, Michaela." "Good night, Nate." Awkwardly, but it seemed like finally a conclusion, as if we had said our final words and could finally sleep. I tossed and turned on the hard floor, trying to find comfort. The excitement of the situation had faded away, and now, the thought of trying to sleep on a hard surface was almost enough to make me wish we had separate rooms. I shifted into different positions and closed my eyes each time, only to feel restless again after 5 minutes. After what seemed like an hour, I pretended to doze off on my phone and discovered that less than 20 minutes had passed. Tonight promised to be long. I listened carefully and heard Michaela's gentle breathing. I dared to sit up for a moment and try to look at her from the foot of the bed, but all I could see was a motionless figure under the blanket. I lay back down and sighed heavily. I closed my eyes again, only to open them a few minutes later still feeling far from sleep. At that moment, I began to think about Michaela and me and the long and winding road that had brought us here. We had known each other for over 2 years. I remembered how we initially had a cautious but cheerful conversation in the office when we first got to know each other. Then, being placed in the same work group, we got to know each other a little better, and there was a gradual realization that with each new facet of her revealed, each quirky personality trait, each hobby, each little thing, I realized that this girl was perfect for me. I still remembered the weighty feeling when I found out she had a boyfriend. It was almost as awful as when I heard shortly after that she was engaged. I wasn't invited to her wedding, which was probably for the best. But since then, we had grown closer, and while I wouldn't call us inseparable these days, more than a few people had commented on our closeness at work. "Are you asleep?" she suddenly asked, interrupting my thoughts. "Yeah," I replied with unexpected excitement as the light suddenly turned on, forcing me to shield my eyes from the bright light. "Damn it, turn it off, please. I feel really uncomfortable." Her voice sounded much closer, more natural. I allowed myself to open one eye and saw her lying at the edge of the bed, looking at me. "Then, take your heartburn medicine," I grumbled. "I told you not to eat that junk at the airport." "No, that's not it," she laughed. "Can you sleep down here?" "I've tried until you turned on the light," I said, trying to sound indifferent. "If you can't do that on the floor, I guess you can sleep on the bed," she said. "I can't force you to sleep on the floor all night." "Can I? Is that really true?" Both my eyes opened wide. "Yeah," she said. "Go on." Not wanting to seem too eager about the idea, I slowly sat up, grabbed a pillow, and crawled slowly to the edge of the bed. I looked at her wearing a simple t-shirt and shorts. Too simple, not attractive, but still very appealing. I tried not to smile broadly as I sat down. She grabbed a few more pillows and started stacking them in the middle of the bed. "What are you doing? How does it look?" She continued building a pillow wall. I chuckled. "Do you really have that little faith in me? I'll let you sleep on the bed, don't complain. Do you think I'll start poking around while you're asleep? I don't know, maybe throw these pillows away. You know you can trust me." She looked at me quietly. For a moment I felt like she regretted her offer, but despite that, she relented and casually dismantled the barrier of pillows, tossing them onto the floor. "Yeah, you're right. I trust you," she said. "Just kidding, I swear," she said tiredly for the third time, turning off the light before I lay down. She immediately turned to one side, her back facing me. I looked at her to the point where it almost hurt. Although I had said it, I almost naturally felt the urge to touch her. Instead, I just lay down, rested my head on the pillow, and stared at the ceiling. "Good night, Michaela," I whispered, for the fourth time, my half of the mattress still warm. I reached across the mattress until I felt it sink under the weight of her body. I was only inches away from touching her now, as we both lay under the blanket. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, feel myself stiffen, and clearly know what I wanted. Instead, I satisfied myself by gazing longingly at her from behind, as if feeling my gaze on her. I saw her turn her head slightly, not enough to look straight into my eyes, but enough for her to see me from the corner of her eye. She didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to her. "Nate, yeah, will you remember this time we slept together?" I chuckled in surprise, and she quickly followed suit. She turned back to look at me, and we chuckled in the darkness, looking at each other. "I'm really glad you said that, and not me," I said amidst laughter. "I had to say that so it wouldn't be weird anymore," I laughed. "I don't know. It's still a little weird. Just a little. Of course, if you tell anyone about this, I'll kill you," she said, "especially your husband. I've never even met your husband." I chuckled, just saying it to ease the awkwardness, in case you're. "What do you think I'll do?" "Hello, I'm Nate. I'm the guy who slept with your wife once. I regret that." She laughed and said, "Go to sleep, Nate." "Good night, Michaela." This time she actually slept. She turned away and closed her eyes, and after a few minutes, she truly drifted off to sleep. But I didn't, at least not at first. I just lay there, listening to her gentle breathing and watching her figure. I thought about all the ways to turn my dream into reality. I could move closer to her, turn to face her. I could pretend to cuddle her in my sleep, or I could just touch her if I was sure she was deeply asleep. I thought about all the options, but in the end, I just lay there until her gentle breathing lulled me to sleep. I almost expected her to appear in my dream. There was a time before when she revealed something very personal. One day, she got drunk enough to tell me about her favorite positions. She never made me think she liked the 69 position. And in fact, it wasn't a position that ever appealed to me. But that evening, she talked about it, and she appeared in a memorable dream doing so. But that night, I didn't dream anything. It seemed like a waste to spend the whole night in bed with a beautiful woman like her and have nothing, not in reality, and not in a dream. And so, when I woke up the next morning, These unresolved sexual feelings didn't diminish. As I woke up, I found the room bathed in gentle morning light. The sunlight streamed directly into the room from the balcony through the sheer curtains gently swaying in the breeze, making the room a constantly shifting, magical space. I lay on my side, watching the movement of the light as I blinked the sleep from my eyes. A moment later, I rolled onto my back and suddenly heard a soft moan and felt someone abruptly retract their hand. I turned back to see Michaela riding beside me, much closer than when we went to sleep, but still far enough apart not to touch. I turned over in bed to face her. We lay close together, so close I could feel her breath on me. I was close enough to see every pore, every wrinkle, every imperfection on her face. Even after a night's sleep and no makeup, she was still beautiful. A few strands of hair fell onto her face. They tickled down there, bothering me. Almost instinctively, I raised my hand and tucked some hair behind her ear. That's all I dared to do. Of course, I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know and feared that everything would go wrong if I started touching her body or kissing her, or anything else that came to my mind. Yet here I was, my hand slowly creeping under the blanket and onto the bed, my mind screaming to stop, but my will completely shattered. I needed contact, any contact, something to bridge the gap between us, a glimmer of hope about the feeling when finally beside her, I felt the tip of my fingers touch my body, but when I expected to touch the fabric of her shirt, I found myself touching bare skin. I gently ran my fingers over what I now realized was my stomach, before feeling the unmistakable joints of my fingers touching the lower part of my chest. My shirt must have ridden up somewhere during the night, but I couldn't see because of the blanket. This gentle touch felt like an electric shock. I almost immediately recoiled, jumping out of bed and heading straight to the bathroom. I splashed water on my face and looked in the mirror, the face staring back at me a strange mix of embarrassment and desire. I lowered the toilet lid, sat down, and encouraged myself. One thing is finding amusement in the absurd situation I found myself in. Another thing is disturbing a colleague or friend in a dream. Then I realized she had left her wristwatch near the sink. The clock read 5:45, still early. She might not wake up for a few hours yet. And I couldn't hide in the bathroom all that time, feeling exhausted. I knew I wanted to return to bed, though I wasn't sure if I had the strength to restrain myself. It took a few more minutes before I felt comfortable enough to leave the bathroom. I walked out hesitantly and saw the clock still in the same place I left it. I stood by the bed for a moment, looking down at her before deciding to crawl back under the covers. I lay down, rested my head on the pillow, and turned to see her still facing towards me, just inches apart. She was lying almost in the middle of the mattress. I contemplated whether to push her back to the other side, but before I could do so, she suddenly stirred in her sleep and unexpectedly hugged me, pulling our bodies closer together. Damn it, I muttered under my breath. Several things happened simultaneously. Her right leg began to rub against mine and intertwined between my legs. I could feel the unmistakable sensation of her chest pressing against my arm, and she laid her head on my shoulder. I froze for a moment until I was sure she was asleep, and even then, I still didn't dare to move. After a moment, perhaps only a minute or two, I felt a sudden urge to release my right hand. I wondered if this was really a comfort, or if I just wanted to take the next foolish step. I convinced myself it was just for comfort, and carefully moved my right hand to avoid waking her up. Almost naturally, she shifted in her sleep to rest her head closer to my chest, and my hand had no choice but to loop around her shoulder, trailing down her back and resting on her hip. Call it cuddling or whatever, but I never expected Michaela and I to end up in such a situation. Many of my fantasies revolved around this, but none of us dared to act because of the fear of making a mistake. I imagined her waking up, screaming, and rushing to the door. Suddenly, I felt her hand slipping under my shirt and slowly starting to massage my stomach, her hand touching my bare skin. I allowed myself to shift my legs slightly and felt her soft, cool legs brushing against mine. Unable to resist, I hugged her. I allowed my hand to rest on the lower part of her back and gently stroked through her t-shirt. At the same time, I tucked some stray hairs behind her ear, those strands bothering me. To complete it, Michaela let out a satisfied moan in her sleep. I didn't know how long we lay like that, maybe 2 minutes or 20 minutes, but regardless of the time, it was pure happiness and agony to live in an unattainable fantasy and simultaneously be stimulated to the point of almost painful and indelible excitement. However, this state was shattered when almost immediately I felt my entire body tense up. Her hand lazily traced up my chest under my shirt as she suddenly froze there, her leg tensing up next to me before slowly retreating towards the edge of the bed. And I might as well have prayed that she had stopped breathing almost naturally. I did the same and pretended to sleep. She didn't move an inch for nearly 30 seconds as I tried to pretend to sleep. After a few more moments, undoubtedly spent trying to figure out if I was dreaming about her or not, her body relaxed again. And to my surprise, she remained in the same position, that is, curled up in a warm embrace. Her hands began to gently stroke up and down my body, slow but purposeful. Suddenly, she froze again. It took me a few seconds to understand why her hand was lying on the left side of my chest and why my heart was pounding so fast for someone supposedly asleep. "Are you awake?" she whispered softly. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "No." Suddenly, her hand slipped out from under my shirt, and she awkwardly moved back to the side of the bed, neither of us looking at each other. "Sorry," she said softly. "It's okay," I replied. "Everything's fine." "Was that cute?" she asked, leaning her voice and running her fingers through her hair. I turned to look at her, and she did the same. "I should have listened to you. I should have just found another hotel," I muttered. "No, Nate, stop," she said. "I'm glad we didn't do that." She smiled at me, and I felt instantly melted. I assessed the situation and made a decision. I leaned in and kissed her. She was clearly taken aback and remained silent for a moment. The blissful satisfaction of feeling her soft, wet lips against mine quickly gave way to a feeling of horror flooding me as I sensed her lips and body go rigid, and I feared I had misinterpreted the situation. But as I prepared to pull back, her lips parted slightly. I felt her hands on me, and we embraced. The sensation was almost overwhelming. I accepted the reality that Michaela and I had kissed with her hand still on me. I quickly realized that I could do the same and swiftly reached my hand under her shirt. It was almost like an electric shock to Michaela, who suddenly pulled away from the kiss and moved away from me, objecting in a string of incomprehensible words. "I'm sorry, I can't, she whispered. "I'm married, damn it. I'm married, oh God. I'm married." If my heart was pounding continuously before, now it almost made me feel like my heart was about to stop. I put both hands on my chest, almost like a criminal being apprehended. At that moment, I dared not touch her. Michaela simply closed her eyes and covered her face with both hands. We both froze in place for a few seconds before I took the initiative, sat up, and started to crawl out of bed. Suddenly, she reached out and grabbed my thigh tightly to stop me from leaving. "Don't go. Stop. Don't go," she exclaimed in disbelief. "It's still too early. Don't get up because of me. Do you want to stay together?" I chuckled weakly. "No, of course not. Or maybe yes, I don't know," I whispered, choosing my words carefully. "It's still too early, but we're already late from last night. If you want to stay, I trust you." I don't. "You don't trust me?" she asked confusedly. "No, I don't trust myself, especially with you." "Did you say something?" "You know you don't have to say it," she said slowly. "If you feel that way, then why react like that?" I'm a girl," I said, waiting. "What are you waiting for?" I started to worry. "Come here," she said softly. And here it is, against all odds, we find ourselves in this ridiculous situation, and out of all the possibilities, now it's presenting itself. Against all odds, that's foolish. But I said I didn't have a condom. Michaela, I called out loudly, turning away from her, lying back on my back, and looking up at the ceiling. At that moment, I was sitting halfway on the bed, unwilling, finally deciding to stand up when suddenly she touched the space between my legs and gripped that part of me tightly. I took a deep breath, and all I could muster was, "Oh." I took this as permission to lie down on the bed next to her. I turned to look at her, but her reaction was completely emotionless. She acted as if she moved her hand up to the waistband of my shorts and slipped inside. She fumbled a bit and grasped my glory with her hand. "Oh my God," I whispered, looking down and almost unable to believe it. Almost randomly, I turned and leaned in to kiss her lips. She tried to move away gently, placing her free hand on my face and turning back to look at the ceiling. "It's okay. Just close your eyes. I'm here," she said naturally. I could hear my breathing getting heavier and heavier as she moved faster and faster, but the truth was Michaela was doing that. It made it more exciting. As this was happening, I blindly reached out and felt her thigh. I traced the curves of her body until I felt the waistband of her shorts under my fingertips. Michaela cleared her throat and spoke softly. "It's okay. You don't have to." "Be quiet," I replied calmly. "Just be quiet." I followed her gaze down for a moment before looking back into her eyes, neither of us avoiding each other's gaze. As I reached into her pants, and then deeper as my breath became more ragged, she stopped, not breathing, not opening her eyes to look into the distance. She took a deep breath. She suddenly withdrew. I was about to ask her to explain when she suddenly sat up and pulled the bedsheet up before, without hesitation, she lifted up the bottom of her shirt. In a moment, we were both naked. After a while, we looked at each other in silence. She looked down before letting her gaze wander over my chest. I admired her firm breasts, although smaller than expected. I moved closer to her as she reached out, placing her hand on my chest and pushing me back onto the bed. She showed courage. "Oh, foolish," I moaned with delight. I liked it, but soon I needed to reciprocate the affection for her, to bring joy to each other. We were both nearing the finish line. "Wait a minute, wait," she said with urgency. "What's the matter?" "Take me, right now," she panted. "Isn't it?" "You? Hurry up, I'm almost there." With that, I firmly held her ankles, and we synchronized. Maybe she was married. Maybe we didn't have a condom, but at that moment I didn't care. She embraced me tightly as I worked with a steady rhythm. I kept up my pace, part of me just wanting to make her unconscious, but even then, I knew it could only be fleeting, so I allowed myself a slow and steady pace. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't hold out for long. It was years of imagining, years of admiring her from afar, years of dreaming about her in waking moments, and years of wanting to kiss her every drunken night. All those nights, everything was built on this. We both moaned at the same time. I moved faster, and we both reached the climax. We hugged each other tightly without daring to move. I didn't know we were like that for how long. It felt like an eternity. We stayed like that for a while. By now, the sun had truly risen, and there were footsteps in the hotel hallway. Michaela and I were still lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "So now, Nate, I still can't breathe. What is that?" "But then what will happen? What should we do?" "I don't know," I said and leaned back to look into her eyes. "That depends on you, but I have no intention of ruining your marriage." "Really?" she asked, raising an eyebrow skeptically. "Is that right? I've always been honest with you. Do you want me?" "Yes," I replied. "If it were up to me, we'd repeat this tomorrow, and the day after, and then I want to be by your side for the rest of my life. I care about you, but you're married, so that's my issue. I just need to try my best to get through this. Can you do that?" "I'll try. I have to. I don't regret what we did," she said with a surprising confidence before adding, "At least not yet. But would you forgive me if we never speak of this again? Do you love your husband?" "Yes, despite this." And I know we've only been married for about 18 months, and that doesn't bode well for us." She chuckled softly with concern. "But yes, I love him. Please don't be angry with me." "I can't be angry at you for being honest. You can ask me anything, Nate." I pondered the questions that could lead me somewhere with her, the questions that could prolong our little courtship, the questions that could make her doubt her marriage, and then fall into my arms instead of with friendship or just childish desire. I asked her when she lost her virginity, a question that surprised her, but she answered rather quickly when I was 16. "How many lovers have you had?" "I only had 4, technically 5 if you count the other." "Is your husband satisfying you?" "Sometimes I am satisfied too." She answered all the other questions without hesitation. This time, she paused for a very long time as she carefully said, "We shouldn't. I shouldn't have asked you that, I know. But anyway, here's the answer. We shouldn't, so please don't tempt me. I'm married, but I don't think I could handle it." "Why not?" "This is not a game." "I don't know. I love my husband, but this is entirely different in a good way." "But I love him." That's the only answer I gave normally, hiding my disappointment. Perhaps that's it. We both stayed on the bed staring at the ceiling. It seemed like this was the end of my thoughts, to look at her one last time before getting her clothes. Instead, she said with concern, "Of course, there's something to be said about removing it from the system. You know, while we're in another city and sitting together in a hotel room," she said cunningly. I stood up straight and looked down at her. She smiled, waiting for me to continue. "Our flight is this afternoon. During this time, we won't eat, watch TV, leave this room, or wear any clothes. I want to touch you anywhere, anytime I want. I want to possess you in every way and remember it. And we won't stop until it's truly necessary." "What then?" "Then we'll stop," I said firmly. "We'll figure out the rest later. At least that way, if we never speak of it again, we'll have a memorable experience." Michaela nodded gently, reaching out and starting to stroke my face lightly. I felt uncomfortable sitting on the chair. The office had paid for first-class plane tickets, but since we missed the flight, we settled for economy. After spending a few hours engaging in sexual activity in a spacious hotel room, I felt somewhat uneasy. Nevertheless, Michaela and I remained close, despite being fully clothed. "How will you get back from the airport?" she asked. "I'll call an Uber. My husband will come to pick me up." "And what about you?" "Nothing. Let me know. I won't lie. Part of me is thinking about the best way to get you back with me." At first, she didn't reply. She just started moving forward on the couch for a few seconds before saying, "We've talked about it. I know. And don't worry, everything is clear. You don't have to worry about me. Just, I'll remember it. And when I remember, I don't know how that feeling will affect me." "Well, I understand your point. I still wonder what will happen with him next time, with your husband," I asked, and she nodded in response. I glanced around the airplane. Amidst the noise of the engines, people wearing headphones, and those sleeping, feeling comfortable enough to ask her, "When you get home from the airport, does he want to have sex?" Michaela also looked around the plane before calmly regaining her composure and answering, "I mean, I've been away all week. What will you do?" "Surely just the usual service, nothing special," I replied. Finally, I was tired but could muster up a question for her. "Don't act strange at the office on Monday, meaning you can't boast about this in front of others or reminisce about us, or conversely, feel too awkward and distance yourself from me." I responded, "No need. It might be difficult, but I want to maintain our friendship, or at least I want to try my best." Almost naturally, I leaned in to kiss her. She didn't pull back. Instead, she almost closed her eyes and puckered her lips. But we both realized and chuckled awkwardly, and in a reluctant spirit, I reached out to her. She laughed and took my hand. Sweet home. I didn't check emails, didn't open luggage or prepare anything. Instead, I simply undressed and collapsed onto the bed. It was a long business trip, but sleeping wasn't easy. Instead, my thoughts began to swirl. I met her husband at the airport, at the baggage claim. I shook his hand firmly and exchanged greetings, but then I stepped aside and thought about them from my bed. I wondered if she was right in her prediction. At this moment, her husband put her in their marital bed. What was she thinking? Was she thinking about me or her husband? I figured I would never know the answers to these questions. I closed my eyes, and the image of Michaela in her naked beauty filled my mind. I wondered how meeting her at the office on Monday would be. I started thinking about my first words, what to say to be sincere. I didn't know.